Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. The United Nations marks today as World Wildlife Day, and this could not have come at a more important time. The IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity found that over 1 million species of wildlife are on the brink of extinction. And with bushfires and environmental changes unfolding across the world, wildlife in forests and life underwater is changing dramatically. All this impacts the world we live in, but how does it impact the future and life of humanity? Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Babar Khan, who's the Director of Wildlife and Regional Head of Sindh and Balochistan at WWF Pakistan. He joins us from Karachi. Also joining us today is Sara Sarfraz, who's an animal rights activist. She joins us from Karachi. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Babar Khan, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about biodiversity and the fact that so much of it we're losing out on, so much of it is going extinct around us, or so much of it is being threatened. The central question that comes up is, with so many issues across the world when it comes to conflict, when it comes to politics, economics, why should people be concerned with this biodiversity loss?
Your question is very pertinent, and you rightly said that the United Nations General Assembly has declared 3rd March is the World Wildlife Day to be observed all over the world as a major concern to raise awareness about the social, economic, and environmental importance of wildlife species, obviously for the humanity. You must know that during the last 40 plus years, if I say very accurately, since 1970s, almost 60% of the global populations of wildlife have, gone extinct, which means that the ecosystems which provide quite a huge amount of ecosystem services, right from fresh water to clean air to food, medicine, shelter, and many other things to the global humanity, have suffered a lot. In a nutshell, these ecosystems cumulatively contribute to around $130 trillion to the global economy. It's not just about the charismatic wildlife species that increase the natural beauty of the landscape. Rather, it's more about the economies at large, the businesses, and the well-being of the human society. So that's why, apart from many other burning and emerging issues, wildlife conservation has been realized as one of the biggest threats to the mankind all over the world. And that's the reason that people should be careful about the wildlife and the vanishing wild animals, which really play a very critical and important role in the ecosystems.
Right. Dr. Babar Khan, as you mentioned, that the extinction of this wildlife is a grave threat to humanity at large, but we also know that it is humans and their actions that have accelerated the extinction process of many of these species. What do you think has been the reason why there has been unabashed form of development at the cost of this wildlife?
As I said earlier, Meshal, wildlife trade, if I call it the illegal wildlife trade, is considered to be the 3rd largest trade in terms of its volume, after human trafficking, smuggling, drugs, and other things. Wildlife in trade generates a lot of economic incentives and return for many people. So apart from their direct and indirect killings, their habitat, is being largely impacted by human-induced activities alongside the natural epidemics and climate change incidences. But wildlife trade, illegal trade of wildlife species, has emerged as one of the biggest challenges of this century, which has largely impacted many of the rare, endangered and critically threatened species all over the world.
Right. Dr. Khan, stay with me. I will talk later on about what is being done on an international level, national level, about trades of these kinds and what can be done more about it. But before that, I want to bring Sara into this conversation. Sara, now you are an animal rights advocate. That, of course, means that you understand how animals can be exploited for various types of uses and to become a part of our lifestyles at the cost of their own lives. How do you seek to move against that, and what do you advocate for exactly?
Absolutely. So human activity and human lifestyle, such things as overpopulation and overconsumption in a way that is not sustainable, has really led to environmental degradation in terms of biodiversity and climate change, the overexploitation of oceans, and many things like that. So anytime we are living in a way that is not sustainable and we have a finite amount of resources, to water scarcity is also going to become a big issue, and soil, and even the way that, pollution of the air. These are all finite resources, and they will end up impacting us in terms of, us entering into the fixed cycle of mass extinction. So what I really do advocate for all of us to live in a way that is conscientious, and basically, I do advocate for cutting out things in dairy.
In various fields, right. Sara, now, as you mentioned that our lifestyles have become unsustainable, and that's what we're seeing, that is the reason why we're seeing climate change impact us at such a deep level. Many people, most people assume that being unsustainable means that it is a burden that should be put on conglomerates and large firms. But in this case, when we talk about, and to a degree that is correct, the average man's carbon footprint might not be that large compared to that of a corporation. But when we talk about animal rights and we talk about how animals are impacted directly, how can an individual make a difference?
Individuals can definitely make a difference in terms of their choices, like on new things and one-time plastics, being conscientious about their water use. These are everyday choices that we're making: what we eat, what we wear. So even wearing things like leather. A lot of companies that are moving forward, like Tesla, do not have leather products, in their cars. So because of this strain on the resource, like for instance, like water, and like raising cattle, which is one of the causes of deforestation around the world.
Right.
So I think, being a bit conscientious about these everyday choices will absolutely help in the long run.
Right. Dr. Babar Khan, Sara mentioned here plastic, and that brings the imagery of the ocean to one's mind. Now, predictions are that by 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. How did we get here?
Yes, Meshal, pollution in general is a big environmental issue, and obviously a huge threat to the marine ecosystems in particular. And plastics constitute around 60% of the marine pollution. In case of Pakistan, a larger part of plastics is generated from the land, but unfortunately that's been dumped off in the rivers. And Indus River being the second largest carrier of plastic to the Arabian Sea. Unfortunately, there are no easy and simple solutions to manage the plastic pollution, particularly when it comes to the oceans. But there are certain challenging options available where we can try to manage part of the plastics from the oceans. For instance, ghost nets. Nowadays, there are, monofilament nylon nets available in the market, which are being used by fishers very extensively. And such nets, after once or twice being used in the fishing practices, are often discarded and left freely in the ocean, which not only catch some of the ETP species, and they get entangled into them and die. But more often, these ghost nets, when are left freely in the sea or ocean, sometimes really damage the corals, reefs, and other marine habitats. So we have been working with the fisher community here in the coast of Sindh and Balochistan to collect some of these plastics, particularly with a focus on ghost nets, to collect and bring them back to the coast, where some of the female communities, females from the local communities, are converting them into some useful stuff like harnesses for donkeys and some other things. Collection of plastic bags from the surface is a bit easier, but once the plastic is drowned in the sea, its collection becomes really a daunting challenge and very difficult task for people to collect it.
Dr. Babar Khan, you're talking challenging options that are out there in order to move towards conservation. We're going to talk about that more, but Sara, going back to you and talking to you a little more about your work. Now, this is something that I feel is important to talk about, especially while we discuss wildlife, is how to be empathetic towards wildlife and to be empathetic towards animals. Now, that seems to be at the bottom of many people's priority list with all the issues that we have to face on a day-to-day basis. But you work towards this. How can campaigns and other awareness programs lead to that empathy?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the campaigns that I do work with is about creating this awareness among schools. So we do have days where we visit schools and we speak about the sentience of animals, and also, we try to make sure that children understand that there is this implicit connection between us and the environment that surrounds us. I think everything from, even the impact of fireworks on wildlife, we try to create this awareness in children that they understand how their actions can directly impact the environment that's around them.
Right. And that, of course, is essential to do, especially at a young age when you have people who are developing how to act in social situations, how to engage with the environment in many different ways. Dr. Babar Khan, again, on this point of creating this awareness and this urgency to do something. Now, close to a quarter of all species on the planet are in danger of becoming extinct in the next few decades. If we take this figure, what would the world look like if that did indeed happen? How damaging would our ecosystems become if this, in fact, happened in the next 20 years, in the next couple of decades?
It's really hard even to imagine a world without wildlife and the stable ecosystems. Because as I said in the beginning of the conversation, that this is not only about some beautiful and really charismatic wild animals, birds and fishes. Rather, it's more about the ecosystems which help sustain the economies, the businesses, and the humankind and the mankind at large. These are the sources which support life on the earth, either it's of the human life or it's of other kinds of life on the earth, in the water, and in the air. So this is not about just the beauty of wildlife. Rather, it needs to be realized, and we need to acknowledge that wildlife is far beyond their beauty.
Right.
They have a very critical and crucial
Dr. Babar
role
Khan, sorry to interrupt, but since we're short on time, I want to get to this point. When you talk about how the ecosystem impacts and sustains our economies, our trade, and specifically on the point of trade, what more needs to be done on the legislation end in order to ensure that there's a fair protection of this wildlife, not just in Pakistan, but all across the world?
Very interesting question you have raised. Actually, wildlife trade and trafficking is more about the regional and global context. In case of Pakistan, it being a country of origin, a country of transit, And a country of consumption is really important in terms of illegal trade. For that, as an individual, we need to acknowledge the impact of our choices. What we use, what we consume, how we consume the natural resources from our environment is really important. At the same time, we as a human society also need to raise our voices as citizens to put the environmental agenda at a bit higher level in the political and social discussion so that people could be aware of the environmental and ecological significance of wildlife and their associated ecosystems. More from the individuals, the government has to develop really favorable and enabling policies to help conserve the rare and unique species of the country and protect these species from poaching and illegal trade across the border as well as within the country. The businesses, alongside the government and human societies and individuals, businesses also need to play a very responsible role. The businesses need to be, because many of the businesses depend largely on the natural resources from these ecosystems. So they need to be responsible, and we need to make them green in terms of sustainable productivity and sustainable consumption patterns. So if we work together, then we can have a
we
really
can move
better
towards that result. Yes, I point there, Sara, you are working towards that in your individual capacity and with the people around you. How have you felt like civilian pressure and pressure from other groups in society, which are not exactly interlinked with the government and other international organizations? What has their role been, and how successful do you feel like civilian pressure can be in this regard?
I absolutely do think that civilian pressure can have a lot of efficacy. So like I said, I think that, worldwide changes, they do start with individuals. And I think that we do have to put pressure on the government to change their policies towards, these MNCs and conglomerates, especially those in manufacturing. So I think that, in terms of economy, that consumer pressure, has always, that's the demand there. And so businesses do respond to that and do that.
Right. Sara, that's an important point you make, and that's where we're going to end this segment on, that the end consumer, of course, has the power to make the change because they are the ones who are consuming. We can say no to consuming products which harm animals. We can say no to consuming products which are involved with unfair supply chains. Thank you so much, Sara Sarfraz, for joining us from Karachi, and Dr. Babar Khan for joining us from Karachi as well. We're going to go for a short break, but when we return, we take a look at what really goes into the cups of coffee produced by some of the largest coffee companies in the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, according to the World Counts, all across the world, 145 million bags of coffee are consumed per year. And while many of us have our morning routines tied to a freshly brewed cup of coffee, not a lot of us take the time to look at where what we drink comes from. Coffee has a dark side, much of which is linked to child labor and unfair wages. Let's discuss this in detail. Joining us, Mr. Achike Chude, who is a human rights activist and also a member of the Justice, Development and Peace Center from Lagos. He joins us from Lagos. Also joining us is Ms. Dace Kavasa, who's a lawyer and sustainability and diversity consultant. She joins us from Latvia. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Chude, let me begin with you. Now, when we talk about coffee and agriculture in general, we see that child labor is hugely concentrated within this sector. And this hasn't just happened now. We have known it for decades. But why can't we clean this industry? Why can't we clean this sector up of this tarnish, up of this illegal practice?
Yes, I mean, it's quite unfortunate. Like you said, this has been going on for years, for decades. And yet it would appear, of course, in the past few years, a lot of people have been talking about it. There have been discussions, not just at national level, but at the international level. The United Nations have made it a topic, especially at the level of the International Labour Organization, ILO, who have also come up with some recommendations. And in fact, in some international conventions also have outlawed child labor in many countries of the world. And what is even ironical is that most countries of the world are also signatories to some of these international instruments outlawing, or banning, child labor. But somehow it would appear that it's all about lip service. Yes, there's a movement towards, abolishing child labor, but I think it is more in theory than in practice because it has continued to grow unabatedly. And of course, in the area of agriculture, little children are playing a very key roles, at the level of agriculture. Most unfortunately, children who should be, in the schools, in learning to become better citizens of their societies, are being pushed into this situation. Of course, people talk about the issue of poverty as playing a major role in that, but the reality is that the right kind of legislations have not been put in place. Most of the countries where these things are happening, especially in the South, in the developing countries of the world, is essentially where some of these terrible practices are taking place. It would appear that the political elites and the political leadership in those particular places prefer to pay lip service to that because, again, of the overwhelming influence of the, certain international international corporations who have had very firm footholds in their countries. So this, to a very large extent, has proved very difficult to tackle.
Right. Mr. Chude, you point there that the legislation has been weak in being able to erode or to mitigate or deal with the problem that we're facing. But before we talk about what is wrong with this legislation, let's try to understand at the highest level, what are some of the global international laws that have been set when we talk about child labor? Ms. Dace Kavasa, what can you tell us about the minimum age, the working conditions, and what is allowed, what is not allowed when we talk about children being involved in labor, especially in the agricultural industry?
I think we have to look at three elements. So one part of the legislation will be related to the global international standards. So we have the ILO conventions on forced labor and children and the Children's Rights Convention. So you have the combination of both labor and child rights documents, instruments, and then the regional ones, depending on where, European Convention, the African Charter, etc. So that would be one thing where the basic minimum prohibition of forced labor and slavery is set in. And slavery is a non-derogative right. So you can't just enslave someone a little bit. So you either enslave them or you don't. So you either, and then it's a forced labor element, which is the question of fair conditions of the safety at work, etc. And of course, the moment we talk about children, it's the question whether the children should be allowed to be exploited, at all. One thing is you have maybe separate view of when you have a family household and the domestic, your own subsistence farming and everyone participates. But that is one thing. And I think here we are talking about child exploitation. So both children and adults exploited at the industry at different levels. Right. And then the other part of regulation is what happens with the supply chain regulation of the businesses.
Ms. Kavasa, sorry to interrupt, but that's something that I want to hold on and explore a little. When you talk about exploitation, and there's one case in which children are involved in family businesses, and then there's one which is a stark difference to it, which is pure and simple exploitation. How do we really define that instance? How do we really define those circumstances? Because it seems like when we talk about exploitation, it does vary from region to region. It becomes a relative term to many. How do we define that under international norms?
So you have one thing, children under the age will differ from country to country. So it's at national level how the child labor conditions are regulated. So for example, many countries regulated up to age of 13, children cannot work at all. So they cannot be employed. You'll do your chores at home, but that's one thing. That's nothing to do. But that you cannot be expected that you are milking even at home, and this is your main job. You're not going to school, and then you're going to the market and selling the milk or whatever your household production is. But in terms of employment formally, so the countries will regulate. So that's age. Age is one. Then the moment we talk about children, that is up to age of 18. So anyone up to age of 18 is a child, by the definition. And therefore, when labor is allowed from 13 to or 12, depends on the country, but say 12, I think, is the earliest as far as I know. It's the conditions of what? The maximum working time, pay that you're supposed to get, no night work. So there are different specific elements of like a standard labor protection. However, for children, there will be extra care, extra protection, and no overtime, no no exploitative conditions. And the exploitation will be then you don't have a choice. You're kind of forced to work overtime. That's exploitation. You don't have a choice not to work.
Right. The choice and agency element taken from you. Ms. Kavasa, stay with me on that point. I just want to jump back to Mr. Chude and talk to him about Africa. In the state of child labor, Africa has the largest number of child laborers. This is the figures that is quoted by the International Labour Organization. When we've been talking about international legislation, and as Ms. Kavasa talked about, regional legislation as well, where do you think Africa has been failing on the ladder in terms of regional legislation?
Yeah, well, it is not as if African countries have not developed some form of legislation, to protect the child. There are all kinds of legislation. For instance, we have one recently that has to do with the girl child and early marriages. That has been an issue, for instance, in the country. And of course, you know that all over the African continent, as a result of the conflicts that we have been having in different regions of the country, from the Congo, to Burundi and all those other countries that we've had, Uganda and co. We've had the issue of child soldiers. Some of them participated in Sierra Leone and then in Liberia and other parts of the continent. So this has become really endemic in the continent. And so a lot is being done, at least at the level of even discussion. And I think that is the key thing. With the activities of international and local organizations, they have brought these issues to the fore. And this has been essentially part of the debate, even among the political leadership within the African continent. So laws have actually been made in some instances, in some countries also. Much more needs to be done. But the reality is that it is one thing to make legislation. It is another thing to go the whole hog to ensure that these legislations are, implemented and put in place. I think that has been the major, issue in the continent.
And Mr. Chude, that may be an issue in many parts of the developing world where there is weak governance. Laws are there, but the implementation just doesn't take place. Ms. Dace Kavasa, that brings an essential point to one's mind. When we talk about coffee, for instance, and we're talking about an investigation which found like coffee giants such as Starbucks were found to be taking coffee beans from farms in which there were children as old as 13 working and producing these coffee beans. Now, these are large companies, those that come in, those that are headquartered in many of the developed parts of the world. When we talk about weak governance in countries which are supplying this raw material, what can be done on the other hand, where these big companies are headquartered? What can be done to enforce laws there?
This is where also legally the instruments of, extraterritorial conviction on human rights abuses will play a role. And that doesn't happen, that regulation is not in place in every, say if we talk about Europe, it's not in place in every European country. So in Holland, on coffee cases, I'm not aware of any case being brought, but on oil, you have cases on violation of the rights outside the country. So say they're brought up in Holland, and you can bring these serious human rights violations up in court there as a human rights violation. So that is one of the ways, making companies headquartered in the country where the coffee is sold being responsible for their supply chain. And of course, the question goes, how far does your responsibility go?
Right.
So the supply chain coffee is so long and so complicated. And then, and at the moment, unfortunately, the tendency is there is more focus on self-regulation of the industry and very little in trying to push the agenda of actual hard law regulation of the industry in the receiving end. Yeah.
Right.
So there are not many countries where you can prosecute, say, a coffee company holding.
Ms. Dace, Kavasa, you work human rights issues globally, and when we talk about this in terms of legal terms, that's something else. But when we talk about this in the domain of human rights, what do you feel like is your opinion when a company should look back into its supply chain? I know it's a long process, as you've mentioned, and many things make it difficult for it to be completely transparent. But when we're talking about the obligation on them, the onus that they have in trying to figure out whether it's a fair supply chain, how much of the responsibility can we put on them? And should we put on them?
If there was a political will, legally that responsibility could be arranged. That should not be a problem. So, as I said, there are countries where it's possible that an NGO or a group of victims could bring a case against a company in Holland, for example. However, so I think there is a lack of political will, and that can be improved. It's possible. And then, of course, it's company own decision. How do companies decide to look at their business? And that's a whole idea of thinking sustainably about the business, not just looking at the price element and your product, but thinking about what is it that you offer. And as slow as it is, fortunately, there are some changes happening also from the consumer side. So they impact the companies with making the choices. And the more there are going to be reports on the actual situations and actual violations and and brought back to the consumer, I think that activity is slowly growing, right. But it's growing. So there's different ways legally, then by encouraging in different political and legal ways, say tax deductions or minimum set standards for company or organization or something, you can encourage to choose a sustainable business. And then also the consumer part. So there are to go about it.
Right, there are ways to go about it. Thank you so much, Ms. Dace Kavasa, for joining us from Latvia and talking to us about this. Mr. Chude, as Ms. Kavasa talked about this, that there are ways to bring the situation in front of the consumer, to bring emphasis on what is actually happening, but transparency plays a key role in all of this. What can be done in places where these products are being produced, where the raw materials are being exported from? How can transparency increase there in order to ensure that the supply chain that goes all the way to these big multinationals is fair and is not involved with any unfair practices or illegal activities?
The coffee business, which we are talking about, is not an illegal enterprise, legal endeavor. But it is the practice, it is what they do in the process of, having, the raw materials and then the added value that is done in European countries. That is where the issue is. The violation of the rights of, certain segment of our society, the younger generation because of poverty. But I think that really, in countries where these products are grown, that something can be done. I believe that governments, have a role, to put pressure on the companies where these things are ultimately sent to, and then.
But what is the hindrance that when we're talking about governments being able to take control and putting pressure there? We do know that it's always, many times it's the other way around, that these corporations have a lot of stronghold over these governments. So what way do we find out of this messy situation?
That is certainly true. I mean, some of them have very, very strong influence. Again, the governments also need to trade with some of these countries. It also adds to the, the growth of the economy. But beyond that, that is not to say that there are things that cannot be done ultimately. And I think that, in countries where this products are being grown, that organizations, civil society organizations that have been growing from strength to strength all the years. And most of these multilateral corporations are actually terrified of the activities of civil society organizations, especially when they concentrate on the malfeasance that they are causing. So I think what one needs to do is to begin to call them out. They are very particular about their image. They want to give the impression that they are maintaining the best practices when it comes to their products, and then, the manufacture and sales of their product. So once you call them out, it can be a very, very embarrassing situation. Consistently, that is what needs to be done. And then in places where they have their, local branches, those ones can be picketed. And I think we did that successfully with tobacco in Nigeria. And that is exactly what we need to do. And then in the countries where they are headquartered, for instance, for some of those people, again, we have an alliance of international, non-governmental organizations all over the world in partnership and collaboration with one another. So they can also begin to focus our attention and to call them out in those places where they are headquartered.
Right.
For instance, the issue of environmental degradation in the Niger Delta, that was exactly what happened, where a lot of them put so much pressure on Shell, that Shell now had to begin to look for ways to readjust, their policies to fit in with what is going on in those countries. These are some of the things. So it's not something that we're going to leave 100% to governments. We know that governments sometimes find themselves compromised, especially weaker countries in Africa.
Right. Mr. Achike, bring up a number of interesting points, and thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insight. We're now joined by Ms. Ieva Miluna, who's an international law expert joining us from Latvia. Thank you so much, Ms. Miluna, for joining us, and welcome to the show. You must have heard the last part of our conversation with Mr. Chude, in which he talked about calling out these corporations that are involved in these malpractices after reports surface. Now, trying to deal with this is also a very complicated situation, especially when single individuals or small businesses or small enterprises are trying to take on these large corporations. In all of this, defamation laws play an important role in being aware of what is overstepping the line and what is legitimate grounds for bringing someone to account. Give us some insight into this. Where does the line, how can we find a balance in both of these cases?
Well, in all of these cases, there have been developments in international law and politics that actually there are initiatives at the level of the United Nations that multinational corporations should start observing human rights. And there is actually quite a bit of work has been done on this, that multinational corporations that are being involved in huge businesses and that are employing, for example, forced labor or child under age of 15 or 13 in the work, that in principle they shall be held accountable. There have been several cases in the courts of the United States and elsewhere, but we are on the way of adopting a multilateral convention on the business and human rights, that certain human rights should be implemented in the course of conducting multinational corporation businesses.
Right. And when we're trying to understand this process of bringing them to trial or bringing a case forward, or if we move one step behind and bringing this case into public notice, rather through the media or other social media platforms, if someone is involved in exploitation, does that constitute as defaming a business?
it does not constitute as a defaming of business, but of course, certain especially non-governmental organizations are very much involved in the work of observing the situation and monitoring the situation. Of course, the United Nations are also keeping an eye on the conventions that concern the rights of the child. For example, with regard to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an almost a universal convention, it prescribes that the main criterion should be the best interests of the child. So, and certainly employing people and children under age of 13 is a little bit too little age to be employed in any practices.
Right, and Ms. Miluna, sorry to interrupt here, but I've been talking about child labor isn't declining, it's decreasing. We're seeing startling figures of human trafficking on the rise, which obviously leads to modern day slavery. These are all issues that have been mentioned in various conventions, but we don't see them being dealt with. What we're seeing is a rise in all of this. Is there another way to deal with all this other than just relying on the United Nations conventions, because they don't seem to be doing a whole lot?
Yeah, that's true. And law is specifically related and implies politics. And I see this as we need to address the politicians who should observe certain moral values along with legal values. But of course, politics is very much connected with finance and economics and businesses. So politics should not proceed and move forward without observing the interests of the people who actually are involved in businesses, because of course they remain still humans and they need to observe certain human rights guarantees that politicians agree upon in all these international forums.
Right. Of course, that would be the ideal if politicians do develop a moral compass and we can rely on that moral compass to take a stand and do what is right. But we'll just have to wait and see if that is really how the things are going to go forward. Thank you so much, Ms. Ieva Miluna, for joining us from Latvia. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.